He thought he understood every word on that contract, until a voice from the margins threatened to unravel everything. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like, and subscribe now. Back to Adrian Volkov. The pen hovered just an inch above the paper, the gold nib catching the warm glow of chandelier light, as crystal glasses reflected across the polished table, the kind of room where deals weren't just signed, they were sealed with power measured in millions and silence measured in fear. Adrian didn't rush decisions men like him never did, but tonight everything had aligned. The Italian delegation sat across from him, their tailored suits sharp, their smiles sharper. The translator stood slightly behind them, calm, precise, delivering each sentence in flawless English, while the contract rested open before Adrian. Heavy cream paper, embossed with authority, the kind of document that could shift entire ports into new hands with a single signature. And yet something felt off, not loud, not obvious, just a whisper beneath the surface. Like a wrong note in a perfect song, and across the room, unnoticed by everyone except perhaps the camera of fate, Maya Carter stood with a tray balanced carefully in her hand, her posture still, her eyes lowered like every waitress trained to disappear into the background. She had learned that invisibility meant safety, especially in rooms where powerful men spoke in languages not everyone was meant to understand. But tonight, invisibility felt like a weight pressing against her chest, because she understood every word the translator spoke, and more importantly, she understood what he wasn't saying. The Italian phrases flowed smoothly, but the meaning had shifted subtle enough to pass unnoticed by anyone who trusted too easily. One clause softened, another twisted, a key term replaced with something almost identical, but not quite, and Maya's fingers tightened slightly against the tray, her heartbeat sinking with each translated sentence. She had seen this before, not in rooms like this, not with men like Adrian Volkov, but in a small office years ago where her mother had signed a document she didn't fully understand, trusting the voice that guided her line by line, and lost everything. Because of it, the memory didn't arrive. Gently it hit like a quiet echo that refused to stay buried. Her mother's voice, her confusion, the finality of a signature that couldn't be undone, and now here it was again, dressed in expensive suits, wrapped in polite language, and no one else in the room seemed to notice. Adrian's gaze lifted briefly, not toward the contract, but toward the reflection in his glass. Something had caught his attention, not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, the kind that kept men like him alive. His eyes shifted slightly, scanning the room until they landed on her just for a second, and in that second Maya knew she had already crossed a line she wasn't supposed to approach, because his eyes didn't just see, they measured, calculated, weighed value and risk. And for a moment the room held its breath, though no one realized that the translator continued smoothly, confident, controlled, unaware that the smallest crack had formed in the illusion. Maya's mind raced. A silent, keep your job, walk away, this wasn't your fight. But another voice, louder this time, refused to be ignored. You know what this is, you know what it does. Her grip loosened slightly, then tightened again. The tray no longer steady, her reflection faint in the polished silverware. A girl who had learned too late what silence costs. Adrian lowered his pen, just slightly, not signing, not yet, his eyes still on her, now fully aware. And the translator paused, just a fraction too long, before continuing, and that was all it took. The space between decision and consequence narrowed to a single breath. Maya stepped forward, just enough for her voice to reach him, low, controlled, but impossible to ignore. Don't sign. That the words did not echo loudly, but they did not need to. The moment they left Maya's lips, the air shifted, as if the room itself had recognized something irreversible. Adrian did not move at first, his pen still hovering just above the signature line, but his eyes no longer rested on the contract. They were fixed on her completely, now the kind of focus that made even seasoned men straighten in their chairs. The translator's voice stumbled for the first time, not enough for anyone untrained to notice, but enough for Adrian to register a fracture in the rhythm. Say that again, he said quietly, his tone calm, but carrying across the table with the weight of authority. Maya felt every pair of eyes turned toward her, some confused, some irritated, some already dismissive. She was not supposed to exist in this moment. She was not supposed to interrupt anything, especially not this. Manager from the side whispered sharply under his breath, telling her to step back, to apologize, to disappear. But Maya did not move. Her heart pounded hard enough. She could feel it in her throat, yet her voice, when it came again, was steady. Your translator is not telling you the truth this time. The silence was complete. Glasses paused halfway to lips, forks hovered inches above plates. Even the low hum of conversation from distant tables seemed to fade. Adrian set the pen down with deliberate precision, not a single sound out of place, then leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her not with anger, not with immediate disbelief, but with something far more dangerous interest. The translator straightened his posture quickly, recovering his composure. There must be some misunderstanding, he said, with a polite smile directed at Adrian, the kind that had likely worked in countless rooms before she is staff. She does not understand the legal language. Adrian did not look at him, not yet. Instead, he gestured faintly toward Maya with 2 fingers. Explained. Maya stepped closer, now placing the tray down on the edge of a nearby service station, her hands finally free, though they trembled slightly at her sides. She did not look at the translator. She looked directly at Adrian because she knew that was the only way this mattered. The clause he just translated about shared control. She began slowly, choosing each word carefully. It does not say shared, it says exclusive. The shift is small in language, but not in meaning. Adrian's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time one of the men seated beside him leaned forward. The translator let out a soft, controlled laugh, as if indulging a harmless mistake. That is incorrect. The Italian phrasing allows for interpretation. Maya repeated, then shook her head. No, the phrasing is exact. She took a breath, then continued, her voice gaining strength. It gives them full operational authority over your shipping routes for a minimum of 5 years and removes your right to contest it in court. Adrian's fingers tapped once against the table, not impatient, not nervous, but calculating. The lawyer seated at his right adjusted his tie slightly, his expression tightening as he flipped a page in the contract, scanning quickly as if trying to confirm or deny what had just been said. Adrian finally turned his head toward the translator, his expression unreadable. Translate that clause again, he said. This time there was no softness in his tone. The translator hesitated just long enough for the truth to reveal itself before he began speaking again, more carefully, now more rigid, but the damage had already been done because Adrian was no longer listening to the words. He was watching the man deliver them, measuring every pause, every inflection, every choice. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because a waitress who was supposed to be invisible had just made the most powerful man at the table stop signing. The translator's voice finished the sentence, but it no longer carried authority. It sounded rehearsed, measured, like someone walking carefully across thin ice. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched longer than anyone at the table was comfortable with, because it was not empty, it was heavy, filled with calculation. His gaze remained fixed on the translator for another second before shifting slowly back to Maya, then to the contract, then back again, as if aligning pieces of a puzzle that had just revealed its hidden edges. Read it, he said quietly. This time the command was not directed at the translator, it was directed at her. Maya felt the weight of it instantly. A waitress being asked to speak over a man hired for precision in a room built on hierarchy. It should not have made sense, but nothing about this moment followed the rules anymore. The manager near the wall took a step forward, ready to intervene, to shut this down before it escalated. But Adrian raised one finger without looking, and the man stopped mid-step, as if the air itself had ordered him still. Maya swallowed once, then reached toward the table, not touching the contract at first, waiting for permission. Adrian gave the smallest nod, and that was enough. She stepped closer, now standing just beside him, close enough to read clearly the fine print, the ink slightly raised under the soft light. She did not rush, she did not stumble. She read the original Italian, allowed her pronunciation precise, her tone calm and unshaken, each word placed exactly where it belonged. And as she translated, she did not summarize, she did not soften, she delivered the meaning exactly as it was written, unfiltered, unapologetic. This clause, she said, pointing lightly, without touching, grants exclusive authority to the external party over all incoming and outgoing shipments under your company's name for 60 months. All disputes must be handled through arbitration selected by that same party you waive the right to challenge jurisdiction in any federal or state court. Adrian's eyes did not leave the page, but something in his posture shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough that the men beside him straightened instinctively. The lawyer leaned closer, now reading faster, flipping pages, checking references. His earlier confidence thinning into something more uncertain. The translator attempted a controlled interruption, that is, an overly literal interpretation. Legal language often requires adjustment for clarity, but Maya did not stop. She continued reading the next section, her voice steady, stronger now, as if each sentence anchored her further in a certainty. The compensation structure is conditional based on performance metrics defined solely by the external party. Failure to meet undefined benchmarks allows immediate termination of your operational control without financial restitution. She looked up, then not at the translator, but at Adrian again. If you sign this, she said quietly, they do not partner with you. They take control. Adrian's fingers pressed lightly against the table. Once again, that same deliberate rhythm as before, but now the room understood it differently. It was not patience, it was restraint. The lawyer cleared his throat subtly. I would like to review that section again, he said, already scanning faster, his earlier assurance replaced with urgency. The translator's composure cracked just slightly, his shoulders tightening, his smile gone, now replaced by something more rigid, more defensive. Adrian finally leaned back fully in his chair, the leather barely creaking under the shift. His gaze moved from the page to the translator slowly, almost lazily, but the temperature in the room dropped without warning. You said shared control. Adrian spoke softly, but every word landed with precision. He said share. The translator replied quickly, but the certainty was gone. Adrian tilted his head just slightly, then repeated the word as if testing it. Shared. The single word hung in the air longer than it should have, and no one answered because everyone now understood that the meaning of that word had just changed everything. The word lingered in the air long after Adrian spoke it, and no one dared to interrupt because it was no longer just a word, it was a test. The translator opened his mouth as if to clarify, but stopped when Adrian lifted his hand slightly, not a command, not yet, just a signal that anything said next would be weighed carefully. Adrian's gaze drifted back to the contract, then to the lawyer beside him, who was now turning pages faster than before, his earlier calm replaced by quiet urgency. The rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have in a room that had fallen completely still. This clause, the lawyer said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He adjusted his glasses, leaned closer, then paused, his expression tightening just enough to confirm what no one wanted to say aloud. Adrian noticed that pause. He noticed everything. His fingers stopped tapping against the table and rested flat against the surface, grounding him in the moment. His voice, when it came again, was even quieter than before. Continue, he said, but this time it was directed at Maya, not the translator. Maya did not hesitate. She had already crossed the line. There was no retreat now. She traced the next section with her eyes, translating directly again, without looking away from the text. This section defines performance benchmarks, but it does not specify measurable standards. It gives full discretion to the external party to determine compliance. Failure to meet undefined expectations allows them to terminate your authority immediately and retain all operational assets under their control. Adrian's jaw tightened, just slightly, not enough for Mosa notice, but enough to change the energy at the table. One of the men across from him shifted in his chair, another reached for his glass, but did not drink. The translator stepped forward, now his composure thinning. This is being taken out of context. Legal documents are complex and require professional interpretation, not assumptions from someone unfamiliar with contract law. Maya finally turned her head toward him for the first time, her eyes steady, not raised, not aggressive, just certain. It is not interpretation. She said it is language, and language does not change based on who is listening. The statement did not come loudly, but it landed harder than anything else that had been said. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose, then leaned forward again, this time placing both hands on the contract, flattening the page, as if anchoring it in place. He did not look at the translator. He did not look at the opposing party. He looked only at the text, then at Maya, then back again, as if deciding which one carried more truth. Who taught you that? He asked. Maya blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the question, but she answered honestly. My mother, she said quietly. She taught me to read everything twice because she did not. The simplicity of the answer settled into the room in a way no legal argument could. Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if something had just been confirmed internally, something deeper than the contract itself. Then he reached for the pen again, and every man at the table leaned forward slightly, expecting the decision, but instead of signing, he lifted the pen just enough to hover above the paper once more, then set it down deliberately off to the side. He looked up slowly, now, his eyes no longer neutral, no longer calculating, but resolved. "We're not signing this," he said calmly, and just like that, the entire direction of the night changed. The sentence did not explode, it settled, and that was what made it more dangerous, the kind of calm decision that did not invite argument. It ended it for her. A moment no one moved. The men across the table exchanged quick glances, their earlier confidence thinning into something less certain. One of them forced a polite smile, attempting to recover. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, carefully leaning forward slightly. "Perhaps we should revisit the language together, ensure clarity before making any final decision." Adrian did not respond immediately. He closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to signal that the document had lost its power. Then he lifted his eyes again, this time not to Maya, not to the translator, but to the man who had just spoken. "Misunderstanding," he repeated softly, as if weighing the word. The man nodded quickly. "Yes, these things happen in international agreements. Nuances can be lost." Adrian tilted his head slightly, then gave a faint, almost amused breath through his nose. "Nuance does not change ownership," he said quietly, and the room felt smaller. Because of it, the translator shifted his weight, now stepping back just slightly, his earlier position of control gone. The lawyer beside Adrian cleared his throat again, more firmly this time. "I need to review the full document in detail before we proceed any further," he said, his voice carrying less authority than before, but more urgency. Adrian gave a small nod without looking at him. "Take your time," he said, then added without raising his voice, "We have already given them enough." Maya stood still where she was, her hands now resting at her sides, unsure if she was meant to stay or leave. The manager watched her from across the room, his expression tight, calculating consequences. But Adrian's attention returned to her again, unexpectedly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Maya Carter," she answered quietly. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, as if placing the name somewhere in his mind. Then he nodded once. "Maya Carter, you read contracts." Often the question caught her off guard, not because of its difficulty, but because of its direction. "I read everything," she said simply. Adrian's gaze did not soften, but it shifted just slightly, as if something had been acknowledged internally. Then he leaned back again, his posture relaxed in appearance, but the room understood the difference. Nothing about him was relaxed now. He turned his attention back to the other side of the table, his voice calm but final. "We will have our legal team rewrite this agreement from the ground up," he said. "Any further discussion will happen after that." The man across from him opened his mouth again, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to salvage what remained, but Adrian raised his hand once more, and this time it was unmistakable. The conversation was over. Glasses were set down, chairs shifted subtly, the rhythm of the room breaking and reforming around a new center of gravity, and through it all Maya remained standing in the same place, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, yet not fully understood. Either she had stepped into a space she was never meant to occupy, and now every eye in the room had seen it. Adrian rose from his chair, slowly adjusting his jacket with practiced ease, then paused just long enough to glance at her again. "You saw it before anyone else," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Maya met his gaze for a second, then lowered it slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit. "I've seen what happens when no one does," she replied. Adrian held that answer for a moment longer than expected, then gave a single nod before turning away, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, not in the contract, not in the deal, but in the way the most powerful man in the room now saw the person who had stopped in the room did not return to normal. It recalibrated. Conversations resumed in low, controlled tones, but the energy had shifted permanently, the kind of shift that did not announce itself, but changed the outcome of everything that followed. Adrian moved away from the table, without hurry, his presence still commanding. Even in motion, the opposing party remained seated for a moment longer, as if unsure whether they had just lost a deal or something far more valuable. The translator avoided Eye contact. Now his earlier precision replaced with careful silence, while Adrian's legal counsel gathered the documents, quickly, no longer treating them as final, but as evidence. Maya reached for her tray again, instinct guiding her back toward the roll. She understood the one that kept her safe, the one that kept her unnoticed, but the weight of what had just happened followed her with every step as she turned toward the service corridor. The manager intercepted her halfway, his voice low, sharp, and urgent. What do you think you just did? He asked, his words controlled but strained. You do not interrupt clients like that. You do not speak unless you're spoken to. Maya lowered her gaze, slightly not in submission, but in recognition of the rules she had broken. I am sorry, she said quietly, though the apology felt incomplete, because she did not regret it. The manager exhaled through his nose, glancing briefly toward the dining room, making sure no one else was watching. You are lucky he did not have you removed, he said, his tone tightening. Go back to your section and do not say another word tonight. Maya nodded once, then stepped past him, continuing toward the back hallway, the noise of the restaurant fading behind her, replaced by the softer hum of the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the familiar rhythm that usually grounded her. But tonight it felt distant, like she was moving through a place she no longer fully belonged to. She set the tray down near the counter, her hands finally still as she leaned lightly against the stainless steel surface, allowing herself a single breath to settle. The moment replayed in fragments, the contract, the words, the silence, Adrian's voice, the decision not to sign, and beneath all of it, the memory that had pushed her forward, the one she could never ignore. She had told herself for years that staying quiet was safer, that knowing more only made things harder, that it was better to disappear into the background and let the world move without her. But tonight had proven something different. Sometimes silence cost more than speaking ever could. Footsteps approached from behind, steady, measured, not rushed, not hesitant. Maya straightened instinctively before turning. Adrian stood a few feet away, now no longer framed by the long table or the presence of others, just a man in a dark suit standing in a place he did not belong, and yet still carrying the same gravity. The kitchen staff had gone quiet, without realizing it, their movements slowing, their voices dropping, as if the air itself had shifted again. Adrian's eyes moved briefly across the room, then settled on her. You left, he said simply, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what he had observed. I thought I was supposed to, she replied, her voice calm but softer now. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, then shook his head slightly. Not yet, he said. The words settled between them, and for a moment nothing else in the kitchen mattered. Not the clatter of plates, not the low murmur of staff, not the steady hum of refrigeration units. All of it faded behind the quiet weight of what had just been said. Maya stood still, her hands at her sides, unsure if she was being corrected or pulled further into something she had never intended to enter. Adrian took a step closer, not aggressively, not with urgency, but with purpose, his presence filling the space. Without effort, you understood every line of that contract, he said, his voice even not a question, but not entirely a statement either. Maya hesitated for half a second, then nodded yes. Adrian's eyes did not leave her, and there was something different in the way he looked now. Not suspicion, not dominance, but assessment layered with something else, something quieter. Why are you working here? He asked. The question was simple, but it landed heavier than anything else that had been said tonight. Maya exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering just enough to gather her thoughts, because answering honestly felt more dangerous than anything she had done at the table. Because it pays, she said finally. Adrian's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. That is not the answer, he said. Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It is the only one that matters. Adrian studied her for another moment, then shifted his weight, slightly folding his arms in a relaxed posture that did not feel relaxed at all. You read legal language, you speak Italian fluently, and you caught a discrepancy that my own people did not, he said quietly, then added, you are not just a waitress. Maya did not respond immediately. The kitchen around them had grown quieter without anyone announcing it. Even the head chef had slowed his movements, pretending to focus on a dish that no longer required attention. Maya finally met Adrian's gaze again. I did not say I was. Adrian held that answer for a moment, then gave the smallest nod, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Where did you learn? He asked. Maya's eyes flickered for just a second, not away from him, but inward toward something she rarely allowed herself to revisit college. She said quietly, then added, I did not finish, Adrian, did not interrupt, did not press. He simply waited, and that silence gave her space to continue. My mother lost everything because she signed something she trusted. She said, her voice steady, but lower now. I learned after that. Adrian's jaw tightened, just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that comes from understanding. Something without needing it, explained further. And now you read everything? He said. Maya nodded. Yes, everything. Adrian let out a slow breath, then uncrossed his arms, his posture shifting again, less guarded but more deliberate. You understood what that contract would have done. He said. Maya did not hesitate this time. It would not have been a partnership. She said it would have been control. Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer. Then he looked past her briefly, as if seeing something beyond the kitchen walls, beyond the restaurant, beyond the immediate moment. Then he returned his attention to her. You stopped it, he said. Maya shook her head slightly. I pointed at it. Adrian's expression changed, just enough to show the difference between those two things. You stopped it, he repeated, this time with quiet certainty, and the distinction mattered more than she expected. The distinction settled deeper than Maya expected, and for a moment she did not know how to respond, because he was not just acknowledging what she had done, he was redefining it in a way that carried weight beyond the moment. Adrian did not look away from her as he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but more deliberate. People miss things like that, he said, not because they are not capable, but because they are not looking for them. Maya felt the truth in that statement more than she wanted to admit. Most people trusted the room, trusted the suits, trusted the structure around them. She had learned not to trust any of it. Adrian took another step closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to lower his voice without losing clarity. You were not supposed to see it, he said. Maya gave a faint, almost tired breath. I was not supposed to understand it. Adrian nodded slightly, as if those two things were not the same, and that difference mattered then. Why speak? He asked. The question hung between them, heavier than the others, because it was not about language or contracts anymore. It was about choice. Maya's fingers curled slightly at her sides as she considered the answer, not the easy one, not the one that would end the conversation, but the one that was true. Because I knew what would happen if I did not, she said. Adrian held her gaze steady. And what would happen? Maya hesitated only briefly, then answered. You would sign something you could not undo. Adrian's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, something sharper, more aware. And you decided that was your responsibility. Maya shook her head slightly. No, she said. I decided it was my mistake if I stayed quiet. The words landed differently this time, not as defiance, not as explanation, but as something grounded, something lived. Adrian let that sit in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that was not empty, but reflective. Then he looked down briefly at his hands, as if measuring something internal, before lifting his gaze back to her again. Most people protect their position, he said. They do not risk it. Maya gave a small nod. That is why most people miss things. Adrian's lips curved, just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest recognition. Then he turned his head, slightly glancing toward the doorway leading back to the dining room, where his team was still gathered, waiting for direction, waiting for him to return. But he did not move immediately. Instead, he looked back at her again, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from assessment to decision. You said you did not finish college, he said. Maya nodded. Yes. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, then asked, what would you have done if you had? Maya blinked, caught off guard by the question. I do not. No, she said. Honestly, Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer carefully before responding. You would have finished reading contracts, he said, and probably written better ones. Maya did not react outwardly, but the words landed somewhere deeper than she expected, not because of what he said, but because of how certain he sounded, as if it was not speculation, but observation. Adrian straightened, then adjusting his jacket once more, the movement precise, controlled, returning him to the version of himself the rest of the world recognized. But he did not leave, not yet. Instead, he paused one final time, his gaze steady on her. Maya Carter, he said quietly, you're not invisible anymore. The words did not raise his voice, but they echoed in a way that lingered long after they were spoken. And for a moment Maya did not move, because she did not know how to exist inside that statement. Not invisible anymore. It was not praise. It was not a warning. It was something in between, something that carried consequence. Adrian watched her carefully, as if measuring how she would respond, not just to him, but to what came next, because men like him did not make observations without intention. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady, but quieter than before. I was not trying to be seen. Adrian nodded. Once I know, he said simply, then added, that is usually when it matters most. The kitchen behind them slowly resumed its rhythm, but it was different now, more aware, more restrained, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something that would ripple beyond this moment. Adrian turned slightly toward the doorway again, then paused, as if reconsidering his next step before speaking once more. You should not be here, he said. Maya's brow tightened slightly. Not in offense, but in confusion. This is where I work, she replied. Adrian shook his head, once not dismissing her words, but reframing them. This is where you are, he said, not where you belong. The distinction settled between them heavier than expected. Maya did not answer immediately, because the statement reached further than the surface. She had spent years building a life around staying unnoticed, around surviving within spaces that were not meant for her. And now he was questioning the foundation of that choice. Adrian took a slow breath, then continued, his tone even measured. You read contracts better than people. I pay to do it, he said. You hear what others miss, you see what others ignore. That is not something you learn by accident. Maya held his gaze this time, not lowering it, not stepping back, because something in his words demanded that she stand still. I learned because I had to, she said. Adrian inclined his head, slightly acknowledging the truth in that answer. Then you should use it, he said. Maya gave a faint, almost incredulous breath. Use it, where Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was something firmer beneath it. Somewhere it matters more than this. The words were not harsh, but they carried weight, because they challenged not just her position, but her choices. Maya's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. You make it sound simple, she said. Adrian did not smile. It is not simple, he replied. It is necessary. The clarity in his voice left no room for misinterpretation. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation had shifted again from what happened tonight to what came after. Adrian glanced toward the dining room one last time, then back at her. My team will review everything, he said. They will find what you found, and they will confirm it. But that is not the point. Maya's expression softened slightly. Then what is? Adrian stepped closer, just enough to lower his voice without losing its certainty. The point is that you saw it first, he said. And that changes things. Maya felt the weight of that statement more than anything else tonight, not because it was loud, but because it was final. Adrian straightened, then turning toward the doorway, this time with intent, as he began to walk away. But after 2 steps he stopped, without turning back. If you had stayed silent, he said quietly without looking at her, I would have signed. And then he continued forward, leaving the space behind him heavier than before, because for the first time Maya understood that what she had done was not just interruption, it was impact. The words followed her long after he disappeared into the dining room, not as an echo, but as a weight that settled in her chest, steady and undeniable. Maya did not move right away, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as the reality of what had just happened unfolded in layers, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, piece by piece. She had stepped out of her place, and the world had not pushed her back. It had shifted instead. The kitchen noise slowly returned around her. Plates clinked, orders were called out, low conversations resumed, but there was a subtle difference in how people looked at her. Now, not openly, not boldly, but enough for her to feel it. The awareness, the question, the recognition that something had changed, even if they could not name it. The manager approached again, his steps measured this time, less sharp than before, his expression controlled, but searching. You need to get back out there, he said quietly, not unkindly, but firmly. We still have guests. Maya nodded automatically, her body moving before her mind fully caught up. She reached for a fresh tray, adjusting her posture, the familiar rhythm returning out of habit, but the feeling was not the same. The weight of the moment followed her as she stepped back into the dining room, where everything looked exactly as it had before, and yet nothing felt unchanged. Adrian had returned to the table, his presence once again at the center of the room. His team gathered closer. Now the contract no longer open in front of him, but closed, resting off to the side like something already decided. The opposing party sat straighter, their earlier confidence replaced with careful politeness. The translator remained silent, his role diminished. Without announcement, Maya moved through the room with practiced precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, maintaining the invisible balance she had mastered for years. but now each step carried a quiet awareness of his presence, not because he demanded attention, but because she knew what he had seen, what he had understood as she passed the table. She did not look directly at him, but she felt his gaze shift briefly in her direction, not lingering, not obvious, just enough to confirm that the moment in the kitchen had not been separate from the one at the table. It was part of the same decision, the same recalibration. The lawyer leaned in, speaking quietly to Adrian, pointing at sections of the document, his tone low but urgent. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression composed, but no longer neutral. The man across from him attempted another careful explanation, gesturing lightly as he spoke, but the energy of persuasion had lost its foundation. Nothing he said carried the same weight anymore, because the certainty had been broken. Maya placed a glass gently onto the table near the edge, then stepped back again, her movement smooth, controlled, the way she had always done it. But this time, she felt the difference. She was aware of herself in the space, not hidden, not unseen, just present. Adrian lifted his hand, slightly acknowledging something the lawyer had said, then leaned back again, his gaze moving once across the table before settling briefly on the contract again. Then he spoke, his voice calm, but unmistakably final. "We will review and respond through our office," he said. "No further discussion tonight." The words closed the conversation completely. No argument followed, no attempt to reopen what had already been decided, because everyone at the table understood that the decision had not been made in that moment. It had been made earlier, when a single voice interrupted something that should have gone unnoticed. Maya turned away, continuing her path through the room, her steps steady, but her thoughts no longer quiet, because for the first time she realized that nothing about her life after tonight would return to what it had been before, not because he had said it, but because she had already crossed the line herself, and there was no way back to being invisible. Once you knew exactly what your voice could change, the evening stretched on, but it no longer carried the same tension. It had transformed into something quieter, more controlled, as if every word spoken now had to pass through an invisible filter of caution. Maya continued her work, moving between tables with the same practiced grace, but the awareness followed her with every step, the memory of Adrian's words, the weight of what she had interrupted, the knowledge that something irreversible had taken place, not just for him, but for her as well. When the final course was cleared and the last glasses were set down, the meeting dissolved without ceremony, no raised voices, no dramatic exits, just a quiet understanding that the outcome had shifted beyond repair. The opposing party stood, offering polite handshakes, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes revealed something else: calculation, reconsideration, uncertainty. The translator remained behind them, silent, his earlier confidence replaced by restraint. Adrian acknowledged each gesture with the same calm authority, but there was no warmth in it, no invitation to continue what had already been closed. As the group began to disperse, Maya stepped back toward the service station, her hands finally free again, the tray resting beside her as she allowed herself a brief pause, her breathing steady, but her thoughts still moving faster than she could settle them. She told herself it was over, that the moment had passed, that she could return to the rhythm she knew, but something inside her resisted that idea, because it was not true. Adrian's voice carried again across the room, not loud, but precise enough to cut through the remaining conversations. Maya, Carter, the sound of her name, stopped her. Before she could step away, she turned slowly, her posture instinctively straightening as every nearby movement seemed to pause. Once more, Adrian stood near the edge of the table, now no longer seated, no longer surrounded in the same way, his presence alone enough to draw attention. "Without effort, come here," he said, not as a command, but as a certainty. Maya hesitated only for a fraction of a second before walking toward him, her steps measured, controlled, the distance between them closing with each second until she stood just within reach of his gaze. The room had not fully emptied yet, and she could feel it, the attention, the quiet observation from those still present, but Adrian did not acknowledge any of it. His focus remained entirely on her. "You read the entire contract correctly?" he said. Maya nodded once. "Yes." Adrian inclined his head slightly, then reached for the folder resting on the table, opening it just enough to expose the pages inside before closing it again. "I will have my team review every line," he said, "but I already know what they will find." Maya did not respond. She did not need to. Adrian stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice, just enough to keep the moment between them contained. You changed the outcome of this deal, he said calmly. Maya's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from the weight of that truth. I only said what was there, she replied. Adrian's gaze did not waver. That is what most people fail to do, he said, then paused for a moment as if deciding what came next, not just in the conversation, but beyond it. When you leave tonight, he continued, I want you to come to my office tomorrow morning. Maya blinked, the words settling slower than she expected. Your office? Adrian nodded. Once the decision already made? Yes, he said simply. We were going to see what else you notice. And just like that, the line she had crossed earlier did not just remain behind her, it extended forward into something she could no longer ignore. The invitation did not feel like an opportunity. It felt like a shift in gravity, something that pulled at everything Maya had built, her routine, her boundaries, her quiet understanding of where she existed in the world. And for a moment she did not answer, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too well what it meant. Adrian did not rush her. He simply waited, his expression steady, his posture unchanged, as if the outcome of this moment was already decided. Maya finally spoke, her voice controlled but softer. Then before I work here tomorrow morning? Adrian's gaze did not flicker. Then you will not be here, he replied, simply, the certainty in his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Maya felt a slight tightening in her chest. Not fear, not resistance, but the recognition that something was being removed from her before she had chosen to let it go. The manager approached again, drawn by the shift in attention, his expression cautious. As he looked between them, is there a problem? He asked carefully. Adrian turned his head, just enough to acknowledge him. No, he said calmly, then added without emphasis, she will not be on your schedule tomorrow. The manager blinked, once caught between instinct and hierarchy, but Adrian had already turned his attention back to Maya, the conversation with anyone else dismissed. Without effort, Maya glanced briefly toward the manager, then back to Adrian, her voice steady again. I did not ask for this. Adrian nodded. Once I know, he said, then paused before continuing. That is usually when it matters most. Again, the same quiet repetition, not persuasion, not pressure, just observation. Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling, not as something forced upon her, but as something placed in front of her, whether she wanted it or not. What happens if I say no? She asked. Adrian did not hesitate. Nothing. He said, you go back to this, you continue exactly as you were. Maya searched his face for something more, a hint of expectation, a trace of disappointment, but there was none, only the same measured calm that had defined every decision he made. And if I say yes, Adrian's gaze held hers, then everything changes. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything else he had said tonight, because they were not about him. They were about her. Maya looked down briefly, her fingers curling slightly as she considered the space between those two outcomes, one familiar, one unknown, one safe, one uncertain. She had spent years choosing the first, without question, building a life around predictability, around staying unnoticed, around avoiding exactly this kind of moment. And yet standing here now, she realized something that unsettled her more than the choice itself. She had already changed. The moment she spoke, Adrian watched her without interruption, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the answer to become clear, not to him, but to her. Maya lifted her gaze again, her voice steadied, not loud, not hesitant. I will be there. Adrian nodded. Once no smile, no visible reaction, just acknowledgement, as if he had expected nothing less than be there at 9. He said, turning slightly, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. But before he stepped away, he paused one final time, his voice quieter now, but more deliberate. You were right to speak, he said. Maya did not respond immediately, because the words landed deeper than she expected, not because of the validation, but because of what they implied. She had not just been heard, she had been understood. Adrian gave a final nod, then walked away, leaving her standing in the same place, but no longer in the same life. The restaurant slowly emptied after that, not in a rush, not with noise, but with the quiet unwinding of a night that had already decided its ending. Maya finished her last task with the same precision she always had, wiping down a table, aligning the silverware, adjusting a glass that no longer needed, adjusting the motions familiar, almost automatic, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. The rhythm of her life had always been predictable. Shifts ended, tips counted, uniform folded away, another day passed without leaving a mark, but tonight had carved something deeper, something she could not smooth over with routine. The manager avoided her for the rest of the evening, not out of anger, but uncertainty, as if he no longer knew exactly how to place her within the structure he controlled, and that alone said more than any reprimand could have. The other staff moved around her carefully, not confronting, not questioning, but aware in ways they had never been before. Maya gathered her things at the end of her shift, her small locker, holding everything she needed for the life she had known: a folded jacket, a worn notebook, a pair of shoes more comfortable than the one she worked in. She held the notebook for a moment longer than usual, her fingers brushing against the edges of pages filled with notes, translations, phrases, legal terms, definitions, things she had taught herself quietly, piece by piece, without direction, without permission, without recognition. She had never expected those pages to matter beyond survival, beyond understanding, just enough to avoid being caught off guard again. But tonight they had done more than that. They had changed something real. She stepped outside into the cool night air, the city alive, and the distance lights stretching across the skyline, cars moving steadily along streets that never truly stopped. The noise felt different now, less overwhelming, more distant, as if she was standing slightly outside of it all, looking in rather than being carried along by it. She took a slow breath, the air sharper than inside, grounding her in a way the restaurant never could. Tomorrow at 9, the words returned, not as pressure, but as a point in time, something fixed, something waiting. She could choose not to go. She could wake up, follow the same routine, return to the same space, and let tonight become nothing more than a story she told herself later about the time she spoke out of turn and nothing came of it. But she knew that was not true anymore, because something had already come of it, something had already shifted. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had carried trays, wiped tables, stayed still when they needed to, and steady when they could not afford not to. And tonight those same hands had pointed at a line of text and refused to let it pass unnoticed. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it had been enough. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass doors behind her, and for a moment she caught her own reflection, not as someone hidden, not as someone passing through, but as someone standing still in her own space, aware of what she had done, aware of what it meant, and aware that the choice in front of her was no longer about safety, it was about direction. She slipped the notebook into her bag, then adjusted the strap over her shoulder, her posture straightening slightly, not out of habit, but out of something new, something quieter but stronger. She turned and began walking down the sidewalk, her steps steady, her pace unhurried, but certain, because for the first time in a long time, she was not moving just to get through the day. She was moving towards something she had not planned, but could no longer ignore. And that night, without anyone announcing it, without any grand declaration, the world shifted just enough to make space for a voice that had refused to stay silent, and a man who had finally chosen to listen. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.